will now move to our final speaker. This morning and early afternoon has just flown by with all of these marvelous presentations. And our final speaker today is Brian L. Myers, speaking on the mystery and metaphysics of spiderwebs, a metaphor for exploring consciousness and imagination. Welcome, Brian.
Spiderwebs. They're just a little bit romantic, a little bit transcendental, a little bit metaphysical. They're just a little bit dangerous and possibly even a little bit magical. But really, why spiderwebs? Exploring spiderwebs is part of a new project, which I'm eager to tell you about. For the project, I will offer 6 common, sensible items as metaphors to discuss and explore how we think and how we experience the world around us. My hope is that if we can compare these common items to some established concepts and ideas, then maybe we can arrive at better ways of talking about consciousness and imagination. Can we reframe our understanding of experience in service of better mental health, or in developing adaptive thinking in a rapidly changing world? And by the way, Charles Darwin opined that adaptation is the key to survival, not fitness or strength. And the idea is that if we can develop the vocabulary and metaphors for understanding something complex, we can more easily discuss and explore it. And the spiderweb is the first of these tools. So today, it's spiderwebs. And let's begin with what we know. Of course, spiders use webs to catch flies. The fly becomes ensnared in the web, and as it struggles to free itself, it vibrates the webbing. And those vibrations transmit sensations to the spider. And that's how the spider learns where the fly is trapped. It subdues the fly and wraps it up in yet ever more webbing. Later on, the spider will feast. And we know this, of course, because it was very clearly described in The Hobbit. And it describes the way we think, how we encounter new thoughts. My fascination with spiderwebs began 2 years ago when I first got to PCC. It was a book by J.T. Fraser called The Genesis and Evolution of Time, a critique of interpretation in physics. Physics, no less. Fraser said something which has stuck with me ever since. He said, "Flies not caught do not exist for the spider." Fraser is referring here to the notion of Umwelt, a term coined by Jacob Uexküll. Umwelt represents the nature of perception or agency or effect that a being has within its environment. It represents its field of operation, the extent and limit of a being's awareness and experience. What Fraser was suggesting, almost by maxim, is that for spiders, their range of awareness extends to the edge of their web. Anything beyond that, the flies not caught, is beyond their experience. And remember that idea because we'll need it for later. And the idea of Umwelt is not new. Uexküll was describing the hunting strategies of ticks, but other thinkers have pondered similar ideas with respect to the human self and how we know things. Plenty of thinkers, Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and others, for example, answered this mystery by dividing the world into the self and everything else. They used a variety of expressions and ideas to describe a subject-object duality. Think of it as a sort of philosophical version of a simple grammatical sentence. For example, spiders hunt flies, subject, verb, object, neatly wrapped up, just like flies in a web. And so I offer the humble spider web as a metaphor for consciousness and imagination. And here's how it works. Our basic spider web model has 4 elements: the spider, its web, the flies that it has caught, and the flies that it has not caught. And so the spider represents the subjective self, our awareness or the mind. While it sits in the middle of its web, it does not even really think that much about itself. It already knows how to function like a spider. It likes to eat flies. and it knows how to spin a web and catch them. And it has adapted other biological functions. It does not really need to think about these things too much. It already knows them. The strands of webbing. These are both the trap for the flies and the pathways that the spider takes to get to the ones it has caught. For our model, let's suppose that the strands of web represent pathways of thinking or cognition. The mental pathways that we travel over and over again to get to our favorite flies become stronger and stickier. They come to mind more easily and more readily because the pathways we most often travel are familiar. Of course, as we develop our mind web, we can always find new ways or new and different pathways to reach our favorite flies. We can adopt new ways of thinking about them, but that takes a little effort. And so the strands of webbing represent how the spider, the self, or the subject interacts with objects in its world. Remember, spiders hunt flies. So the flies that we have caught are the objects that we think about. They can be anything: ideas, problems, concepts, perceptions, even actual occasions. And so they are the objects of imagination that have become ensnared in our awareness or consciousness. And to be clear, by objects of imagination, I mean to suggest that the flies themselves do not represent the activity of imagining or thinking. Instead, they are the objects or things that we think about. Our favorites, the ideas that we think about or attend to most, become habitual. We think these thoughts often and wrap them up in ever more webbing. They become shortcuts of thinking, cliches, biases, or stereotypes. They attract our attention because they are familiar, but they're really just the first thought we turn to in moments of questioning, unfocus, or distraction. And if we were thinking about imagination, let's call the flies we have caught objects of functional imagination. And I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. But first, we round out our model with flies that we have not caught. And we never really know exactly how many there are. We don't have any direct experience with them. They're speculative. And if we're talking about imagination, we can call them objects of speculative imagination. And I should note here that I borrowed the terms functional and speculative from Alfred North Whitehead's book, The Function of Reason. And now that we have our four model elements, let's talk about functional imagination. We can describe it as the activity of thinking, often in service to a particular problem or goal. Examples include seeking business solutions. How do we create and market a better product? Or engineering. How do we build an airplane that flies? How do we land people on the moon or on Mars? How do we reverse the unraveling of a world? Functional imagination is what happens when we are confronted by a problem or a challenge and we assume there is a solution. We just haven't found it yet. Finding a solution may require drawing puzzle pieces from across a variety of disciplines. That's why our favorite fly thoughts are often found at the intersection of many strands of webbing. Integral points of view are often called for, and this is a more nimble and progressive way of thinking, let's say, than thinking about the same processes from the same disciplines in the same way over and over again, possibly hoping to get to a different solution. And so the activity of doing functional imagination, by the way, is the sense of agency. And from a clinical perspective, we might suggest that agency is the feeling of efficacy, that what we do has purpose, meaning, and value, that we have control over objects in our environment, even thoughts, and that we can affect change, that we can solve problems. And the problem before us right now is how do we catch as many ideas as possible? Spiders construct their webs to be utilitarian and efficient in service of this one single goal. But let's talk about the flies that we don't catch. Maybe someone will argue that worrying about them is foolish, a waste of time, that these are beyond our experience and that they don't exist. But I want to push back on that idea, and I'm not alone either. Fichte and Schelling argue with Kant all the time about whether we can ever really know what we don't already know. And that brings us to speculative imagination. We might think of this as pushing the boundaries and frontiers of consciousness and creativity. Speculative imagination is thinking about things for which we have no direct experience. We haven't caught those flies, and here I am already counting them. But how does that work? We already have the idea or concept of flies from the ones that we've caught. They're right here in the web. And we already have the experience of catching them too. And if we put the concept and the experience together, we might infer or intuit the existence of flies that got away. And maybe we can arrive at some new ideas. This is the version of intuition that we get from transcendentalism. And that doesn't really sound so complicated. We might even suggest that speculative imagination is the realm of metaphors, inference, inductive thinking, or metaphysics. It is also the stuff of fairy tale, fantasy, theoretical physics, poets, science fiction, and possibly madness. Think Rod Serling or Doctor Who. And perhaps it is. The science of statistics, by the way, uses this process all the time. We take data from a limited sample set and use it to infer a larger hypothesis. Presidential opinion polls, for example, never interview every American, but they describe larger trends among voters. Remember when I suggested that spiderwebs might be just a little bit dangerous? When it comes to choosing what thoughts to attend to, we should be mindful. The objects of imagination that we think about most often get wrapped up in the most webbing. They become bigger and beg for our attention. The danger is that thinking unreasoned thoughts in the same way over and over can lead us down ever stickier strands until we ourselves become stuck. In other words, if pursued too often, they might ensnare us in the very trap that we have set for the flies. The Buddhists talk about this phenomenon quite a lot. Though they use different language, they say that we should be mindful of unbalanced cravings or desires. We should be mindful of unbalanced emotions or desperate attachments to things we should let go of, such as inflated sense of self or attachment to ego, or possibly even attachment to stale flies. And maybe attachment to stale flies is what Nietzsche meant when he said, "He who fights with monsters might take care lest he thereby become the monster. And if you gaze too long into the abyss gazes also into you." I would like to conclude today with a note about the study of philosophy itself and why we do it. One idea is that philosophy is about the pursuit of freedom. Our rights may be unalienable. We like to think that our rights are bestowed upon us by the whims of government or by God, and maybe they are, and we can argue about that later. But I submit to you that the only true freedom we have is our ability to think and to choose. We have the ability to change the way we think about or perceive ourselves. David Abram and others have noted that magic is the ability to alter your consciousness at will. But could that also describe philosophy? Might we also suppose that reason is the ability to alter one's consciousness? And that in the pursuit of freedom, is reason the why we do it? The point is, how powerful would it be to decide for ourselves who we want to be? We can choose our identity by our preferences and our reasoned choices. It just depends on what we attend to, what we think about. But reason is a learned skill, you see. It took me many years to get even this far. And not everyone has the time, inclination, or patience to figure it out. And that's why spiderwebs are important. They are common and sensible. We get the message because we see them all the time. And the point is, we can construct our mental spiderwebs however we like. And if we attend to them with patience, intention, and reason, we can better understand ourselves and become the kind of person we most want to be. And doing that much can change our experience. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you for that really practical application of philosophy to daily life and to self-development and self-understanding. I think this is such a magnificent way to end. I see Saraliza's hand and then Jake's hand. Please go ahead, Saraliza.
Yeah, thanks so much for an interesting use of something that's just so common and all around us. So we probably would be terrified to know how many spiders are around us right now. I was wondering, because you were talking about cobwebs and kind of like in broad terms, and I was wondering if you think that the functions are kind of universal across webbing, or if like, because there are different types of webs. So there's like the orb web, the ones that you see on Halloween decorations, there's funnel webs, cobwebs. If the change in web structure affects the function of consciousness in any way, or if you're just staying at a more like broad level of function of consciousness in terms of webbing.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And here I'm sort of hoping that my friend Goethe is watching over my shoulder. But I thought about getting into sort of the materialism of the webs and the structure themselves. And if we get into sort of the aesthetics of spider webs, well, we're going to have to wait until next week when we talk about that. But I kind of wanted to avoid getting into that trap here because there's just so much. And it's enough right now to posit the general idea and perhaps develop the details later on.
Thanks, Brian. Jake, please go ahead.
Thanks for that, Brian. That was really wonderful. Matt referred to it as an extended metaphor in his comment, which I'm sure is appropriate. I actually slightly wonder how metaphorical it even is, though, that there's a sense of a web-like relationship to our thinking and our minds that we pick up on so naturally, and talk in that language so powerfully that it almost seems like the web is doing something in the world that participates in something that our minds do in their own way. So that was just a thought I had. And then I guess my question is, when you're thinking about these things, you brought in the work of some of the German idealists you mentioned, and Whitehead. When I was listening to you talk, two other figures kept popping into my mind. On the one hand, I was thinking of Wittgenstein, who describes his philosophy in the Philosophical Investigations. What's the aim of your philosophy? And he says, to show the fly the way out of the bottle. So that sense of a kind of philosophical therapy seemed to me to resonate with what you were getting at in some of your approach. But then also more constructively, Charles Saunders Peirce's notion of abduction, this capacity to speculatively reach out beyond what we know in order to almost feel our way into a deeper sense of what might be. And I wanted to ask if, so my question is kind of what other figures are working there in the background, are helping you to weave this web and to bring it forward?
Yeah, well, to answer your first question, I think we like to suppose that we think linearly, and perhaps many people do. But I also suspect that many people think by pulling ideas from all over the place. And so our pathway of thinking isn't linear, but so much as rhizomatic, let's say. And to answer your second question, You know, it comes back to, I add to the collection our friend Coleridge, and the primary and secondary imagination. And I didn't really have room to get into those today, but they kind of add an element of almost cosmology to the idea of thinking. And so, you know, and then of course we get into, you know, a lot of the things that we studied last semester. For example, a lot of the poets, I think Shelley perhaps might enjoy this. And who else? Yeah, I don't know. I think spiderwebs are kind of a really fabulous bridge between sort of this earthly idea of empiricism and materialist point of view, because they have to anchor onto earthly sticks. But there's an element of romanticism in cosmology, because when you look at a spiderweb gleaming in the moonlight, for example, or when you think of drops of dew gleaming in the morning sun, it adds sort of an ethereal element of cosmic radiance, maybe.
That's cool. Thank you.
What a great note to end on, cosmic radiance. Thank you, Brian and Jake, for bringing that forward.